Hello folks, welcome back to our recorded lectures for HI 237. This is Remaking Ireland, the Vikings and the Irish. Okay, so some of the challenges of looking at quote-unquote Viking Ireland have to do with historiography, first and foremost. So I want to refer to 1959 and a famous lecture by Binchy called The Passing of the Old Order, in which he claimed that the Viking period was essentially Armageddon for the Irish, that it broke the old social order, it destroyed Irish institutions, taught them to wage all-out war. Now, this is a very old and out-of-fashion hypothesis. Really, the old order had already passed with the coming of Christianity. Also, it's far less destruction than was traditionally thought. And let's be perfectly honest here, we're talking about the Irish. The native Irish were no angels themselves. I'm allowed to say that. I'm Irish. At least my mother's family is Irish. Still, it's a very difficult period to study, not just because of source problems, but because the field itself has been stunted. I mean, Ireland has had a very long struggle for independence, and as a result, up until quite recently, it's not been particularly interested in looking in depth at the history of one of the many colonizing forces that have made it miserable over the centuries. So this popular image of the Vikings as destructive actually hampered serious scholarly interest for a long time. Even the acknowledgement of Scandinavian contributions to the urban history of places like Dublin was not of much interest because of the rural orientation of Ireland up until the last few decades. So again, it is stereotype smashing time, guys. So let's take a look. Not sure why we had no animations there. Oh well. Let's take a look at Ireland before the Vikings, just to sort of situate ourselves. Obviously, looking at Ireland in the early medieval period was very difficult. It lacked sources almost completely in the earlier centuries, and the historian is at the mercy of late medieval synthesized histories, which may or may not have had much truth to them. So this is another heroic culture. So many of the sources that purport to tell its early history have to be read in that light. It's not unlike the sagas themselves, really. We know that Ireland had a decentralized political structure, and in the earliest period, this meant many local kings ruling over their small territories, often with the help of small armed retinues. But by the 8th century, we do see differences in status and rank between kings. They're not all petty kings, basically. We see the emergence of an ardrai, a high king, in this century. Now, to avoid getting too deeply into the morass of Irish politics, I'm just going to give a few important examples. I'm going to start with the most important, the O'Neill kings. Now, they're a dynasty that claims descent from Niall of the Nine Hostages, the famous High King who is almost certainly historical. We're about 90% sure, and certainly the family itself absolutely existed. By the 8th century, they are dominant in the northern half of Ireland. How they get there is unclear. There are plenty of famous conflicts, battles in the pseudo-historical or semi-legendary tradition of early Irish history, most having to do with their conquest of Ulster, but whether any of them specifically happened is up in the air. About the only thing we can be relatively sure of, based on the earliest annals, is that they did fight the kings of Leinster successfully, and they did rise to the position of kings of Tara. Now, these kings of Tara did come from different subfamilies within the O'Neill. This is not a single unified dynasty as we think of as the term, but rather a clan grouping. And there's often great rivalry within the O'Neill themselves, which could leave them open to outside attack. They're at the peak of their power by the year 800. That's all downhill from there. Generally, the reason we think they were successful is because they shifted the base of their power to focusing on territory rather than just the clan-based group. And when they took over new land, they actually take over the tribal name of whoever was already there. And what undid them in the end is the division into separate power blocks, so the northern O'Neill versus the southern O'Neill. There's no more cooperation. There's no feeling of ancestral solidarity. Also, their rivals, the kings of Munster, were growing much more powerful. Now, there is another kingdom worth noting. It's a small kingdom in the north the Dalriada, which actually expands into western Scotland from the late 5th century. Now, this Scottish colony goes down its own path. Their royals in Scotland actually intermarry with Pictish royals. This eventually leads to Kenneth MacAlpine in the 9th century and the Kingdom of Alba. But in a lot of ways, the Kingdom of Dalriada in Scotland stays very Irish. Its law, its ecclesiastical language, and its culture. And the cultural ties between it and Ireland were always very strong. Now, socially speaking, Irish society was based on links between kin groups and also a form of client-patron relationship. So a network of kin groups would owe clientship dues to a network of lords who owed dues to the king. The dues were generally reckoned in cattle within kin groups, and leading members of the family had to ensure they could provide for everyone out to the second cousins. Now, something you should understand is that Irish society kind of idolized law. The legists were one of the learned professions, along with poets and druids. So the written law may have been a scholarly pursuit as much as it was a practical tool. Much of the country is a patchwork of small farms. Larger farms had ring forts. Property tended to belong to families and not individuals. Now, early medieval Ireland is a world of limited resources, and many of these resources were concentrated in the church, especially as conversion takes hold. And in fact, they're often connected to royal lineages. Columba, who was the founder of Iona, was from the O'Neill. Cadet branches of royal dynasties often become what you might call princes of the church. Some of these monasteries become home to royal treasures, or they become the royal necropolis. Now, monasteries could also form hierarchical confederations of sorts. They would have many estates and troops of their own. And really, the biggest of the Irish monasteries fought over what you might call ecclesiastical overlordship. This included Iona, but also Kildare, which was linked to St. Bridget, and Armagh, which was the monastery of St. Patrick. The most important thing to remember is that this is not a centralized society, but it is an exceptionally complex one. It developed along its own lines because it was never Romanized. So the Vikings are not popping into a primitive void when they decide to go to Ireland. They are in fact entering a society that is not unlike their own in a lot of ways. And still with the lack of animations. Not sure what that's about. I'm not starting over though, so we're just going to continue. So when raiding begins, we actually see relatively few initial literary responses to the Viking raids. The focus in Irish literature, again, is on this heroic age with mythological ancestors, so it's prior to the Viking period. Certainly some clerical writers do see the raids as the wrath of God against those misbehaving, particularly those not keeping the Sabbath. But really, when it comes down to it, the native Irish kings also attack the church. Somewhat less frequently, but it's a thing they expect from secular people. So they may have seen the actions of Irish kings as roughly equivalent with the actions of the Northmen. Of course, the most important thing to remember about the Irish annals is that they may have been composed later, but they are drawing on earlier sources that have since been lost. Now, we don't actually see much detailed discussion of the Vikings in Irish literature until the 12th century, with the Cogath, which, as your textbook tells you, was a way of celebrating the achievements of Brian Boru. So it's kind of like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle in that sense, and King Alfred. So when 12th century writers depict the Vikings as powerful and ruthless, it's often intended to make Irish victories appear more glorious. But other sources from this period simply treat the Vikings of Dublin as one of many regional powers. Now, when you focus on 9th century writers, however, they usually do paint a fairly bleak picture. It may have been because of the raids. There were large numbers of native Irish who were taken and enslaved. There's one record of a raid on Armagh where 700 were taken in one attack. So, this may have had a similar impact on Irish morale that the Great Army had on English morale. Now, the first raid specified in the sources as being significant was one on Recru, which may have been Rathlin Island, in 795. This is, of course, very common as a raid on a northern monastery. Um, they like to kind of date the beginning of their local Viking age by that, I've noticed. Um, the Annals of Ulster talk about people being taken captive as early as 821. We suspect that most of the early raiders were Norwegians. They were closest, and their attention might have been drawn by the wealth of the Irish church. Also, from the position of the slave trade, it's very convenient to show up in monasteries on feast days and have your pick of who to capture or enslave. Now, there are sharp increases in raiding starting in the 830s. The Annals of Ulster are all about what the heathen plundered and how many times in 1 month some of the monasteries got hit. In general, things seem to have gone very badly for the Irish in this decade. There are plenty of defeats recorded by the annalists, including the death of some major figures. Now, 841, we see the annals marking the founding of Dublin and Lindushail. So these are the first permanent settlements of the Scandinavians, the long forts, and we'll talk more about them shortly. Vikings also had temporary fortified camps that would last for the winter, for example. But these are different. I mean, Dublin is the Irish equivalent of Kiev on the Dnieper for the Scandinavians, and even Lindushail was occupied well into the 10th century. So really, they have permanent settlements in Ireland a generation before any of their compatriots did in England. Now, these two long forts directly threatened Maelsechnaill, who was the king of Meath and later the king of Tara. And they were really making his life quite difficult. 2 years prior to when he had taken over from his father, the Vikings from Lindushail had actually attacked one of his father's client kings. And what happens with that is that if you can't defend your clients, you're not much of a patron. And they no longer have to, be loyal to you. So this is all a very serious challenge to first Dad and then Maelsechnaill authority. And all of this is seriously complicated by strife between the O'Neill kings themselves as they jockey for position. The raiding in the 840s was particularly brutal. We see a reference in the Frankish Annals of Saint Bertin for 847. After they had been under attack from the Vikings for many years, the Irish were made tributaries to them. The Vikings have possessed themselves, without opposition, of all the islands round about and have settled them. It's probably a bit of an exaggeration, but this is how the Franks see it, and that probably doesn't mean good things for the Irish. Franks. The Franks not quite understanding what's going on again, obviously. Now, we do have some indications, for instance, that churchmen were becoming involved in fighting, often leading monastic levies as part of local defense, and also some evidence that the resistance becomes more coordinated. And there are some significant victories by a number of kings, including Maelsechnaill. Now, back to the Annals of Saint Bertin for a moment. We see a record in them of an Irish embassy to Charles the Bald in 848, and they claimed that they had been successful in driving the Vikings out of their territory and offered gifts to Charles. So maybe this really grim reference from the previous year is, somewhat retrospectively projected backwards, trying to make the news from 848 look even better. That would be a very classic sort of thing for an analyst to do. All right, you're going to love the image on this next slide. All right, so there is one Viking leader of this earlier period who is worthy of a closer look, because the Irish hated him. To the chroniclers of the time and afterwards, Turgeis is basically the devil. So he's called Turgeis or Turgeisius. This might be an Irish version of a Norse name Thorgils. We don't have a description of him. We don't have any information about his life before Ireland. He becomes infamous for sacking Armagh in either 839 or 840. Remember, this is the monastery of St. Patrick, one of the most important Christian sites in Ireland. There was a great deal of damage done. Goods were stolen, tombs were desecrated, monks were killed. But he does something that's even worse, believe it or not. He allows pagan rites to be performed, and perhaps even animal sacrifices to be made on the altar in St. Patrick's Church. Now, a few years later, in 844, he is said to have taken part in a fleet that raids up the Shannon River and chooses to devote its attention to sacking the monastery of Clonmacnois, which happens to be a major educational center. And we are told by some of the later sources that he allowed his wife Oda to perform as an oracle sitting on the high altar. Now, a lot of this comes from the Kogoth, and it's obviously a bit dubious in places, but it's hard to argue against the idea that it was probably based on oral tradition. For some reason, Turgeis is built up as the predominant Viking villain of the early period. Now, he is captured in the end by Melseshnel. He is bound hand and foot and tossed into a lake to drown. It's a pretty conclusive end to Turgeis. But because he's such a villain in the literary tradition, there's actually a more elaborate story that's invented to explain his death, and this is awesome. I always have to share this one. Supposedly, Melseshnel lured him and 15 of his followers out onto an island in the lake. They said basically, we submit. Please go to this island. We have left 16 beautiful women there for you. So he and his 15 friends go out there. They grab the women, who remove their disguises and reveal that they're in fact young men with daggers, and they proceed to stab the Vikings loads of times. I really like that. Cross-dressing Irish assassins killing Vikings. What more do you want? That said, he's often the one who's given credit for founding Dublin. And something else that comes out in sources is that supposedly his onslaught was prophesied by earlier holy men who foretold doom for the monasteries at his hands. So when you read Irish Resistance to the Northmen, which is an excerpt from the Kogoth, just ask yourself why they're catastrophizing this in the way that they did. Why paint all of this as retrospective propaganda? It's fun stuff. There's some really great material in there about all of the effects on the church, which you really do want to read. Okay, so what about integration? How did this begin to happen? You're going to be reading The Life of Saint Findan, which is a great bit from hagiography that illustrates how the Northmen were becoming integrated in Irish society. And we'll take a look at that at our Zoom session. Now, we also see a lot of cases of how the Irish and the Vikings actually worked together rather well. Again, they're very similar culturally speaking, and so the Vikings are integrated pretty quickly into this violent political climate of medieval Ireland. So in the 850s, we see the beginnings of military collaboration. One O'Neill sub-king, Kinnaid of North Brega, allied with the Vikings. This is a little early to be doing this, mind you. It's in 851, and at the time, Melseshnel was not impressed with him. So we're told that he and another O'Neill king basically had Kinnaid drowned. There are some arguments to be made that they maybe had him killed just because they didn't particularly like him as well, but it's still a little early to be allying with the Vikings, I would argue. We do see a change in the makeup of the Vikings in Ireland in the 850s, and this is reflected very obscurely in our Irish sources. We see the arrival of what they call the black foreigners who attack the white foreigners. Annoyingly, they don't specify the identity of these two different groups, but it has been argued that they are the black foreigners are the Danes, and the white foreigners are the Norse. It seems overly simplistic. They may be references to specific groups, not specifically ethnic groups. And the dark foreigners seem to be cut off from their homeland by the late 9th century, and they continue to act independently. But none of their leaders is actually called king until Ragnall in 917, who's called king of the dark foreigners. Now, here's an interesting point about why it's problematic to make the dark, fair division Danish and Norse. Ragnall is a grandson of Ivar, who was, of course, Norse. So what would he be doing leading Danes? Maybe he takes over the remnants of the Dark Foreigners after defeating their previous leader. How do we know? So integration between different groups of Vikings is happening, possibly, as well as between Vikings and Irish. Kerbal, who was the king of Osraig, was one of the Irish kings who exploited Viking alliances most effectively in the second half of the 9th century. He played rival Viking groups off against each other. He allied himself with some. Now, he was fighting Maelsechnaill, so he needed all the military help he could get. He is condemned by some monastic writers, but they also concede that he fought against Viking bands who threatened his kingdom. He even destroyed a long fort on the River Barrow, and it's a very complex situation, basically. Now, the slave trade was a major economic factor in the first half of the century. Women in particular were often captured as concubines or household slaves, and many wound up in Scandinavia or in the East. But the capture of the Irish by slave traders seems to have ebbed by the second half of the century. After all, the Scandinavians are becoming more settled in the island. There are only 6 references to the taking of captives in Ireland in the annals between 853 and 873. Probably, it's a little harder to enslave people that you're intermarrying with. Now, we have an interesting question regarding a specific group called the Gaelged or the Foreign Irish. We don't really know who they were. They're mentioned in all the chronicles as fighting against Dublin in the 850s. And one set of annals calls them Irish foster sons of the Norwegians, which is super interesting, because both cultures do have the tradition of fosterage. The Irish have fosterage for affection and for money. The Norse, if Iceland is looked at as an example, have an economic component to their foster system as well. Certainly there's loads of marriage alliances between Norse, Danish, and Irish families of high rank. So we have numerous cases of this being used to cement political alliances, and fosterage comes along with that as well. Now, the Gaelged could also have simply been mercenaries. It is really hard to say. We don't know for sure. But we can make an argument that acculturation is happening because there are a lot of commonalities in the cultures to help that along. I'm going to be reading The Vikings in Ireland 847 to 917. It's an excerpt from the Annals of Ulster. So take a look at relationships between the Irish and the Scandinavians in that, and we'll do that at the Zoom session as well. Alright, so the question of towns. Did Ireland have towns prior to the Viking period? The answer is basically yes and no. No, because there were no actual towns. Yes, because the monasteries served as hubs in Irish society that wound up taking on some of the same characteristics. So the largest monasteries, places like Armagh and Glendalough, had workshop areas, had streets. They facilitated distribution, trade, other secular functions. They served a social purpose, not just a religious purpose. That being said, they are still part of the monastic structure. Most of the trade that they would encourage was in luxury items and handicrafts for royal or ecclesiastical clients. Now, there's an interesting note about the medieval mindset regarding Irish towns. By the 12th century, all Irish towns were attributed to the Norse because the Irish were believed not to have been able to build them. Gerald of Wales says, "The Irish attach no importance to cities. They make the woods their strongholds and the hogs their trenches." Yeah, you would think a Welshman would be a little kinder than that, all things considered. Now, we don't know what the Vikings themselves called their first settlements. Longfort is an Irish word from the contemporary annals, and it translates as defended ship camp or shore fortress. But part of the point of the earliest settlements was to find safe anchorages and beaching points for the ships. There's no reason to think that all of the Longfort were the same sort of place. The name gets applied to a variety of different sites. This includes temporary raiding bases, army camps, rural settlements, sometimes the earliest towns, as I said. We do see an Irish word, dún or dunoff. This has been argued to have been a distinction made between ship camps and internal military camps, but in some cases it seems to have been used for camps near water as well. What can we discern from this? The whole vocabulary is still fluid. It's hard to pin down exactly what a term means at all times, which suggests that really there's no standardization. Okay, a little bit more for towns and trades, and then close this one out. Dublin was the major success story. It may have been founded with the idea of making it a permanent settlement. It was used as a base from which to set up other camps as early as 845. Archaeology gives us evidence that the 9th century settlement was different than other long forts. There were multiple Norse cemeteries, including female burials. And the historical evidence is suggestive as well. The fact that Dublin is, as we've discussed, is fought over, it's a strategic location. It's kind of a gateway market center, I would argue. Now, moving into the 10th century, with towns well established at Dublin, Waterford, and Limerick, we see clear evidence for trading relationships in the archaeological record. There are about 20 different major settlements in the 10th century, but most didn't survive. The 3 I mentioned were the only 3 that were at least more or less on continuous sites. Now, these sites are much more definitively urban than they are Irish. They're probably modeled after places like York and Chester. They likely copied Anglo-Saxon fortification. Mostly, they needed it. But I would say the big thing here is probably that, they're international trading centers, rather. The mass incorporation of silver into Ireland helps, feed groups like jewelers and so forth. It's likely that a lot of the silver would have been melted down from Arab originals. How much trading was done from Ireland to other countries is another matter entirely. We don't have much evidence one way or the other. We do have an Irish poem called the Book of the Remaking, and it tells us that the kings of Dublin ordered taxes from the Dubliners based on their occupation, so traders, for instance, and paying those taxes or putting themselves on the rolls put them under the king's protection. The Irish would have been dependent on the northern market towns for bringing in certain goods. There's a poem that's highly relevant here from the Book of the Remaking. The tax that they are required to pay over to Dublin, a pack horse load of salt and half a pack horse of salt meat. So that's what he needed to take to the market. The Scandinavians, of course, did import luxury goods as well. The Irish appear to have been very fond of textiles, raving about multicolored silks and satins in a lot of our sources. And certainly Irish goods were also exported. The ringed cloak pin seems to have been a particularly popular style, but the question, of course, is whether it was made by an Irish craftsman and exported, or whether it was made by a Scandinavian metalworker in Ireland, following Irish styles. But it is a popular style, and it's copied like crazy, basically. Slaves are being exported in much fewer numbers. Coins, and actual Hiberno-Scandinavian coins. Specifically, Sitric Silkenbeard, who was the king of Dublin at the end of the 10th century, was the first to mint first king in Ireland to mint coins. They were meant to facilitate international trade, but the Irish actually resented the heck out of that at first. They didn't use it. They eventually were encouraged to use coin to trade with Dublin and to pay land rents or taxes, basically. Alright, that will do us for Ireland. Um, Make sure you come right back for the next one on Frankish kingdoms and their Viking experience. Thanks very much, guys.